Owning a home. Why it's your worst investment. Owning a home can be a terrible investment. It's an illiquid asset that requires high upfront costs and is subject to depreciation. It can also be a huge financial burden if you're unable to keep up with your mortgage payments, if your neighborhood goes down the tubes with some industrial plant moving in next door or something like that, or if your city, town, or neighborhood just becomes unpopular. In addition to that, it's not as profitable as owning investments in other assets such as stocks and bonds, and it's difficult to predict the future appreciation of home prices. Did I even mention that the tax benefits associated with owning a home are often minimal, making it not as lucrative as you'd expect? Let me go into more detail. I'm Derek West, host of Finance Squared. Like, subscribe, click the notification bell if you get any value out of this video and you want more hard-hitting content just like this. Buying a home is the best option among terrible options. The intro that you watched was kind of harsh, and while true, it can mislead people into thinking that buying a home is never a good option. I'll explain why that's not the case, but I also will explain why owning a home is still a bad investment. Whenever I talk to people about my philosophy of homeownership, I kind of always get a negative response. And frankly, it's kind of understandable. Homeownership has been so ingrained in our society that anyone speaking to the other side of the equation is generally considered a heretic. Let me cut that off at the pass, and let me say that I'm not saying that owning a home has zero benefits. As a matter of fact, it has many benefits. For example, building equity. When you rent, you're merely paying for someone else's mortgage and building their equity instead of your own. When you own a home, you're taking advantage of the opportunity to build your own equity and increase your net worth. As you pay off your mortgage, you increase your equity, which can be used as a source of funds if needed. There are tax benefits, overrated, but nonetheless they are there. Owning a home can provide significant benefits that are not available when you rent. As a homeowner, you can deduct mortgage interest, property taxes, and certain other expenses from your tax bill each year. This can result in considerable savings over time. Again, slightly overrated, but the savings are real and they are there. It also provides stability. Homeowners provide a sense of security that's not available when renting. You can make changes to your home as you see fit without worrying about a landlord putting a stop to it or giving you a hard time. You also don't need to worry about a landlord raising the rent on you or not renewing your lease if you're more of an eclectic renter and you have more eclectic home taste. If you have more eclectic home interior design philosophy. When you own a home, that's not a concern, and you can stay there as long as you want. And as a matter of fact, as long as you stay there, your cost of home ownership goes down. Because you see, the longer you're paying off your rent, the less you actually owe, until the point where you're just paying property taxes. You see, there's a reason why it's so popular around the globe. The benefits are obvious, and the downsides not so obvious. But there are downsides, including the fact that home ownership can be much more expensive. That's sort of a broad statement. Is there any way to quantify whether owning a home or renting a home is the right way to go? As a matter of fact, there is. Let's take a look at how to calculate if you should be renting versus owning. Owning versus renting formula. What is the owning versus renting formula? I.e. the cost of renting versus the fees, the taxes, and the maintenance cost of home ownership. There is a formula for home ownership. Did you know that? Determine whether or not it's worth it to own versus rent takes a little bit of work on your side, mathematically that is. And I know talking about equations on videos is typically an engagement killer, but I'll try and keep it fun and entertaining. You see, it goes like this. If the total sum of your rent payments over the period of time was less than your total payments, including mortgage, property taxes, insurance, PMI, home ownership fees, maintenance, everything associated with home ownership, if that cost over that same time period and in that same place is greater, then renting is generally cheaper than buying. When deciding whether to buy or rent a home, it's important to compare the costs of each option in the area you're looking to live. A comparison between owning a home in Birmingham, Alabama, and renting an apartment in New York or San Francisco or Miami or Austin, well, that's a no-brainer. Buying a home requires a large down payment and closing costs, while renting requires a security deposit and possibly, pet deposit, things like that. The ongoing costs of owning a home include mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, homeownership fees in some cases, and of course maintenance, while the ongoing cost of renting includes rent payments and utilities. Each of those costs should be added to the appropriate column when making your decision. The key is to realize that the longer you stay in one place, the more costly renting is, and the more sense owning where you live makes. If you plan to stay at your location for a short time, renting may be the better option, since it will more than likely be cheaper, and you don't have to worry about selling the home when you move. On the other hand, if you plan to stay for a longer period of time, buying may be the better option, since it will allow you to build equity in the home and benefit from the accumulated tax advantages of home ownership. The cost of living in a particular area is also a factor to consider when deciding whether to buy or rent. Generally, areas with higher cost of living will require higher down payments and higher monthly mortgage payments, making renting a more attractive option. On the other hand, areas with lower cost of living, they provide more affordable homes, making buying a more attractive option. But just the general cost of buying a home and its comparison to renting is a little bit unfair, because people usually rent as much as they need and no more, whereas the opposite is true when people buy a home. People tend to buy more house than they need, and there's a number of reasons for that. Let's take a look at the reasons why people buy more houses than they need. A number of reasons can cause people to buy more than what they need when looking for a home, particularly the idea that is a quote-unquote good investment. But other reasons include just overestimating their space needs. One of the most common reasons why people mistakenly buy larger homes than they need is because they don't take the time to think about their future needs, and particularly overestimate just how much space they'll need. For example, if you're planning on having children, do you really need to have a room for each of them, or will a room for the boys and the girls and I guess the other genders, will that do? Do you really need that man cave with the bar and the big screen TV? Or will the living room do just fine? I'm not saying all those things are bad, but doing without them will likely give you more room in your budget for other things. But nevertheless, those things are popular with home buyers, which tend to drive up the prices of homes. People often don't consider the hidden cost of home ownership, which is another reason why people mistakenly buy bigger homes than they need. Buying a bigger house means more than just having more space for all your stuff. It also means higher closing costs, higher furnishing costs, higher property taxes, higher home ownership insurance costs, higher utility costs, higher repair and maintenance costs, higher energy costs, and higher renovation costs. These costs can add up quickly, as you can imagine. So it's important to be aware of them before you buy, and to also make sure that the house that you need matches the space that you need, that the size of the house matches your needs, not necessarily your wants. All of these things can be considered falling into the McMansion trap. It was a common mistake that people were doing when buying homes back before the Great Recession of the 2008-2009 time frame. McMansions, large luxurious homes that were popular during that era, but are kind of falling out of favor with younger buyers. So keeping in mind that the larger your house, the larger your costs may be, and they may not necessarily correlate with the larger the return you get on that investment. Keeping that in mind alone will let you be more profitable when you purchase your home. Let's deep dive into a common mistake that people fall into, which is to underestimate the total cost of ownership of a home. See, one of the reasons that people tend to spend much more on a house than they need is that they underestimate the total cost of ownership. A big cost that often gets overlooked includes property taxes, but there's so much more to it than that. Home ownership fees, realtor fees, closing costs. One of the biggest ones people overlook is maintenance and upgrades. Even if you're looking to add more value to your property to get it to appreciate in price more quickly, you have to make sure that you take into account the cost of doing so. That includes, depending on where you live, fees for getting permits, estimates on construction, costs of labor and materials, or opportunity costs of you doing it yourself. All that adds up, and it tends to not be reciprocated. And while it can cause the value of a property to increase, is that cost greater than the cost of actually executing the upgrades? Oftentimes people find out that it's not. Another cost that people tend to find that aren't as great as they think are the tax benefits of homeownership. The tax benefits of homeownership are slightly overrated. I said it before, but the tax benefits of owning a home, while real, tend to be overrated, and in a lot of cases don't really justify the cost of owning versus renting, particularly if you purchase a house that is more than you can afford. The mortgage interest deduction is only available for the first $750,000 in mortgage debt. That's a phenomenon that's rather new thanks to some tax legislation that passed recently. Nevertheless, it's true. This means that if you owe more than $750,000, you won't be able to take advantage of the deduction. And it's true that that amount could be substantial. Depending on your repayment timeline and your repayment schedule, whether you took a 30-year mortgage or a 15-year mortgage or even a 10-year mortgage, well, that's going to determine what your interest deduction will be. As you understand that interest tends to be front-loaded in a lot of debt repayment situations. So as time goes on, your interest deduction becomes less and less. And if you really overpay for your house, as houses are becoming more and more expensive, even in parts of the country that one wouldn't expect them to be, Dallas, Memphis, etc., you start getting into the area where you can't deduct your interest. Now again, I'm not saying that the interest deduction isn't real or it isn't significant. It can reduce your tax liability and may knock you down into a lower tax bracket, which will save you some money. I am saying that you might be able to get that same amount without all the hassle of mowing your lawn to meet the requirements of your HOA, and also avoid paying extraordinary closing fees. Let's take a look at owning stocks as an alternative to home ownership. If we take a look at the site long-term trend, and we examine the history of the S&P 500 versus home prices using the Case-Shiller Home Price Index, we see that the S&P 500 has beat out home prices since at least the 1950s. Now that's probably saying a little bit more about our economic policy as a country than it is about stocks versus home ownership. Because if you take a look at that same index, you'll see that both stocks and home ownership appreciated at the same price before the 1950s. That is an entirely different topic for an entirely different video. In any case, if you rent a cheap apartment somewhere and consistently invest the difference you would have paid into your house, you more than likely would have been just as wealthy, perhaps even wealthier, simply by not getting into the housing market. Now remember what I said. You need to rent something cheap. That formula doesn't work if you overpay on renting either. And overpaying on renting has the distinct advantage of taking your money and leaving you with nothing in the end. So I say all that to say, buying a home is not a good investment in the long run. The reason being that it requires money to sustain it, like property taxes, maintenance, and insurance. Millennials in particular are finding out the hard way that there are hidden costs owning a home and it is the number one reason that they regret buying a house in the first place. Over time, the value of your home might increase, but oftentimes not enough to cover the cost of ownership. And typically, if you were to save or invest the difference you would have spent purchasing a house, you would have matched or beat any gains you would have received from buying that house. One thing I want to be clear on is that I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy a house, or even that you won't make some money when you take the plunge, or even that buying is not a better option than renting. In my opinion, buying a home is better than renting for your finances. I am saying that it isn't a great investment. A bad investment is a bank account because you lose money in the long run as interest eats away at your savings. An average investment is a certificate of deposit. Oftentimes, our certificate of deposit can match or beat an inflation rate. A good investment is an investment in bonds, which oftentimes beats the inflation rate, current times notwithstanding. And a pretty good investment is an investment in the S&P 500 over the last 80 years or so. And a great investment is buying Apple in 1987 and holding it till now. Buying a home, in many instances, only beats savings in each of these categories. Homes are useful in another way. Homes have utility in the same way that groceries and owning a car have utility. Each of those lose you money, while buying a house, while maybe not being your best investment, lets you set down roots, particularly if you have a growing family. And of course, investing in homes for wealth creation or house hacking, those can actually be very lucrative. And that topic deserves a separate video all in and of itself. Just beware and don't buy the hype. You likely aren't getting a great deal in your domicile, at least not as great as you think. And just that knowledge alone will set you up for success in your home ownership and investment journey. Now it's over to you. Drop a comment with your thoughts on home ownership. Are you a millennial who regrets purchasing a home? Let me know in the description down below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more great videos on topics just like this. And remember, a goal without a plan is a wish. A goal with a plan and no action is a wish list. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.